Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to present to you tonight this lecture, this presentation on principles of unity. Whose photo is that on this first slide? Is there a connection with Princeton University? Yes. What is that connection? Well, I thought he retired in 2011, but Emily Goshi, who's a first-year graduate student here, says he taught a class last semester at Princeton, so he still maintains his connection. And he was invited to be here tonight, and I was just told minutes ago that he was delighted to hear about his presentation, but unfortunately he's traveling. So I've asked Emily to send this PDF. Well, this is not a PDF, but I generated a PDF from this presentation to Professor West. So let's begin. I wanted to thank the, first of all, the Princeton University Baha'i Club, and then also the USG Projects Board and the Office of Religious Life. What does USG stand for? Okay, excellent. All right, now I have a forthcoming paper that's in press, and I've started off with two epigraphs. Can anyone tell me what an epigraph is? It's not an epitaph. Let me give you a clue, so I'll give the first epigraph here. And this is it. No two men can be found who may be said to be outwardly and inwardly united. Again, no two men can be found who may be said to be outwardly and inwardly united. So an epigraph is simply a beginning quotation. This quotation will be at the beginning of the paper that is in press. The second quotation: the evidences of discord and malice are apparent everywhere, though all were made for harmony and union. The author, Baha, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, the youngest of the independent world religions. Welcome. Please have a seat.
Thank you.
What is this a photo of? Can anyone tell us? Right, the inside of the Baha'i House of Worship in Wilmette. And the forthcoming paper, the main title is called 50 Baha'i Principles of Unity. And this is the citation for the forthcoming paper. It will appear in Baha'i Studies Review, which is behind schedule. This is the 2012 volume, now it's 2014. And by permission of Intellect, which is the press that owns Baha'i Studies Review, this will be posted online. And there's the URL. I'm sure it could be posted elsewhere as well. I haven't put it up yet, but I will as soon as the paper is published. I may even do it beforehand. Introduction. Cornell West on the Baha'i faith. Now, Cornell West is a committed Christian, but he has a tremendous amount of respect for the Baha'i faith, and he was interviewed a couple of times, and this is one segment from these interviews, which I'm going to play for you now.
I have come to have a profound admiration for brothers and sisters of the Baha'i faith. I've actually been busy for that, of course, one of the great artists of the 20th century of the Baha'i faith. They talk over and over again about what it meant to him. Elaine Locke, of course, probably one of the greatest philosophic minds of the middle part of the 20th century, was also of Baha'i faith. First black Rhodes Scholar, chairman of the philosophy department at Howard University for 42 years. What I've always been taken by is the very genuine universalism of the Baha'i faith. One of the first religious groups to really hit racism and white supremacy head on decades ago. By decades, I mean many decades ago, and remain consistent about it. Who fundamentally believe, as I do, in the sanctity of each and every person, and have been willing to live and die based on a Baha'i faith. When you think about it, Baha'i was integrated before the YMCA, the YWCA. Even prior to the Communist Party, which is the first secular institution to integrate blacks and whites and red. Faith has always been countercultural. Baha'i faith is not we believe in once a God, once a family. We believe in genuine community, we believe in compassion, and we believe in spiritual maturity. That's what Brother Mark meant when he said we need a revolution of priority. Baha'i faith understood that about that. When you talk about race and legacy and white supremacy, there's no doubt when the history is written, the true history is written, the history of this country, Baha'i faith will be one of the 11 in the American loaf that allowed the democratic loaf to expand because of the anti-racist witness of those Baha'i faith. So that there is a real sense in which Christian like myself is profoundly humbled before Baha'i brothers and sisters in the physical aspect and their life lives and so forth.
As was mentioned in the introduction, one of the books that I wrote was on William Locke. It's sold out, so by permission of the publisher, you can in fact download it from my website, from Bahá'íLibrary.com. I've published, edited, and published previously unpublished speeches and essays by Locke, which are also available on the website. I obtained silent film clips of Locke from the National Archives, and so on, and all that is available. I discovered 2 letters previously unknown by Shelby Effendi, who led the Baha'i Revolt from 1921 to 1957, and so on. So there's a wealth of material on Elaine Locke. The leading scholar on Elaine Locke, Leonard Harris of Purdue, you'll see in his earlier writings that he always associated Elaine Locke with the Baha'i faith, but never thought that Locke joined. And then I discovered, or was provided with a proof from the National Baha'i Archives, something called the Baha'i Historical Record, which was given out, cards for Baha'is to fill out in 1935. And Locke filled his out after being, I looked at the correspondence, hounded by the Secretary of the Spiritual Assembly, the local Baha'i Council in Washington, D.C., 3 times. And on the 3rd time, Locke filled out one side of the 2-sided card. And that's where he said that he became a Baha'i in the year 1918. That photo that you saw in the video of Locke in his cap and gown, the same year that he received his PhD in 1918, that's the date of the year that he embraced the Baha'i faith. And he remained a Baha'i until his death in 1954. Theory and method, I'm going to introduce you to a way of analyzing world religions, which we can call the illness-cure analytical prism. This is a framework of analysis. Before I read the work of Stephen Prothero, who had popularized this, he's a best-selling author, and he talks about this in a book called God Is Not One, and I've corresponded with him. I used to open my world religions classes, I taught at university for about 10 years, by saying that world religions can be analyzed in this way. Let's take a look at this perspective on world religions. Okay, so basically world religions can be looked at as systems of salvation, liberation, or harmony. And what they offer, in other words, the salvation, liberation, or harmony, is directly connected to what scholars call the human predicament. What is the human predicament? The evil that plagues mankind, the plight that humanity faces. So whatever the major problem facing humanity is, that religion offers a way out. So here's Bahá'í's analysis. I agree in part, and I might emphasize something else, but we're in basic agreement. Hinduism, the problem is the perpetual cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. It's something it's only known as called samsara. So the solution is liberation from this never-ending cycle. For Buddhism, like I used to tell my students, the first noble truth is life's a bitch and tomorrow we die, in modern terms. In other words, all life is suffering. And then the Buddha goes on in the rest of the Four Noble Truths to talk about liberation from suffering. Here, Prothero says the solution is awakening. Well, I suppose it's awakening to that, becoming alive to the problem of suffering and its root cause, which is creating attachment and so on, and then following the Noble Eightfold Path and so forth. We're not going to cover all the religions, these are just highlighting some of the major examples of how religions can be looked at through the illness cure model. In Judaism, the problem is exile, the solution is to return to God. In Christianity, the problem is sin, the solution is salvation, at least in Western Christianity. The emphasis is somewhat different in, say, Assyrian Christianity, the Church of the East. What I call in my dissertation Persian Christianity. In Islam, the problem is pride, the solution is submission or surrender to the will of God. And Prothero doesn't cover the Baha'i faith in his book, God is Not One. So I'm just adding this. The problem in the Baha'i worldview is disunity. And just go back to those two quotes, which come from a tablet called the Lohe Maksud, the tablet of Maksud. Maksud is the person who received this particular tablet in Baha'i terminology, simply means an open letter. So the problem is profound disunity, and the solution is world unity, but broader than that. So if no two men can be found on earth today who may be said to be both outwardly and inwardly united, then the cure for that, using this same illness cure model, means that the Baha'i faith offers teachings on unity that range from family relations to international relations. It's really quite profound. Which is why, using this paradigm analysis, we're taking a look at the Baha'i paradigm of unity. So if Buddhism says, well, suffering is the human predicament, then we would expect that Buddhism has a tremendous amount of profound things to say about suffering and liberation from it, which is quite true. Similarly, if the Baha'i model is that the world is plagued with disunity and its answer is unity, it sounds a lot easier said than done, then the Baha'i faith must have a lot to say about unity as well, and it does. And so here's another short quote from Baha'u'llah. And for those of you, remember, this is Princeton University, so in the academic study of religion, you have to be conversant with the source languages. So I will be using what we call transliteration. I will represent in Latin characters the Persian and or Arabic originals for each of these texts and translations. Baha'u'llah says, shut your eyes to estrangement, Igonagi, then fix your eyes upon unity, Igonagi. They sound similar, don't they? So here we have unity and disunity. Alright, well let's take a look at the principles of unity. Now I have slides, but I'm not going to read all these slides. What I did about 3 hours ago, because this thought didn't occur to me, was to put the keywords in bold, red, and underlined, so it's overkill. You'll get the point when you see the slide, and then we can go back to any slide during the discussion, and like I said, I'll make this available on the web as well, so you can study the text, and you can study more text by accessing the paper. So prior iterations, in other words, I've been thinking about this for a long time. And I first published 22 Baha'i Principles of Unity in this book. This is actually my doctoral dissertation, Paradise and Paradigm, Key Symbols in Persian Christianity and the Baha'i Faith, and it was published by the State University of New York Press in 1999. So at that time, I didn't have 50 principles, I had 22. And so here are some quotations that I won't read, and the page numbers, and you can see this online too. The next iteration was in December 2000, where I found more Baha'i Principles of Unity. Now they're 33. This is a photograph from the first international conference on modern religions and religious movements in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the Baha'i and Baha'i faiths. Does the cursor show? Yeah, that's me, and I'm asking a question. Everybody's looking at me. They don't have a picture of my presentation, which is okay, but that's the conference. So this took place in the latter part of December 2000, and I presented a paper on Baha'u'llah's multiple messiahship. And the way I started out my presentation was, I said, well, first I want to present the Baha'i perspective on Judaism. Israel being a Jewish state. So when in Rome, do as the Romans do, when in Israel, talk about Judaism. So that went over well. And then as an introduction to the Baha'i faith, I just read out 33 Baha'i Principles of Unity. And then highlighted my paper on Baha'u'llah's multiple messiahship. Then something dramatic happened. A graduate student from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem stood up and said, I just believe everything you said. And I have a question for you. Can I remain a Jew and be a Baha'i, or do I have to leave Judaism to be a Baha'i? And my answer was both. Okay, so this is not a systematic theology of Baha'i Principles of Unity. It's simply a way of starting out, in a way chronologically, historically, by looking at major Baha'i texts on unity, starting with something called the Tablet of Unity, Baha et Tahad, the Tablet of Unity. So, the first unity is unity in religion. And I won't read the Persian, but you'll see it right underneath there, so we know that this is anchored in an authentic text. And what we're interested here is unity within a religion. We're going to see unity among religions as a separate principle later. And one interesting quote is, Baha'u'llah says that togetherness, it's the last quote here, is the mystic sword of God. Now, Baha'u'llah's first legislative act in April 1863 in Baghdad was to outlaw holy war. Obviously, holy war didn't stop, but the decree that it should stop was uttered in 1863 by Baha'u'llah. Unity in speech. There are three dimensions to unity of speech. One, unity of discourse. Two, harmony of word and deed. And three, exercise of wisdom in speech. Alright, unity in religious acts is the third principle. And one of the things that Baha'u'llah says is that from the ocean of Islam have branched numerous gulfs. Thus do the stones weep, and the pen of the All-High laments. Because this is divisive. I'm using the Canadian pronunciation. I was in Canada 14 years. This is divisive. The next unity is unity of rank and station. It means equality of station. And if this were put into practice, Baha'u'llah says the world would become a paradise. Unity of souls is next, and it basically means that souls, meaning human beings, because we are not just animals, we are spiritual as well, should be focused on divine teachings, divine principles, as they appear from age to age. unity of people and wealth. There's an interesting wordplay, and Baha talks about voluntary sharing, movasat, versus the equitable distribution of wealth, mosavat. They sound similar, but they're different. So he says that voluntary sharing of wealth is altruistic. It has a higher station than the equitable distribution of wealth. And as you know, or some of you may know, that one of the major Baha'i principles is an end to extremes of wealth and poverty. That's not included in these principles because I could not find that teaching expressed as a unity of. So a couple of words you'll see, Baha and Etihad, and things like Tawheed. So I look for Baha'i teachings that use this language, unity of. And that's my criteria of selection. Unity of God is how Baha'u'llah ends this particular tablet. Next we go to other types of unity. This here is the prison. The prison cell that Baha'u'llah was confined in Akka, across the bay from Haifa, for a period of time, starting in August 1868. Unity of existence and unity of vision. Now, Baha'u'llah talks about a unity that's actually above these unities. So, one way of looking at the oneness of being is that all of creation reflects the attributes of God. But that God is above those attributes. God is above even the attribute of singleness. Unity of the manifestations of God. This is a term that Baha'is use. Instead of prophets of God, they're roughly equivalent to prophets of God. Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, Zoroaster, the Buddha, and so on. And one of the writings of Baha'u'llah says, inasmuch as these birds of the celestial throne are all sent down from the heaven of the will of God, and as they all rise to proclaim his irresistible faith, they therefore are regarded as one soul and the same person, meaning in their qualities, not that they're actually one soul and one person. They're different individuals, obviously. Okay, spiritual oneness, or another way of translating the Persian expression, is unity of spirit. There is a very interesting tablet, very poetic, very moving, called the Tablet of the Holy Mirror. Shoghi Effendi, who I mentioned before, translated this after becoming the guardian of the Baha'i faith in 1921. It is the first tablet in its entirety that he translated in his office as guardian. Before that, he of course translated a number of other texts. In the untranslated Persian text, the narrator, who is Baha'u'llah, of this ark, gives out a secret, divulges a secret, and everybody's enraptured. So it's described as spiritual oneness. Unity among religions. We saw principle one, unity in religion. And then we're going to transition into Abu Baha's principles of unity. So we have both Baha'u'llah here and Abu Baha. I mentioned a tablet, a famous writing of Baha'u'llah's called the Lohe Terazat, which is the tablet of ornaments. We actually named one of our sons Taraz after this tablet, which taught ornament meaning examples of a good character. And so the second Taraz is to consort with the followers of all religions in a spirit of friendliness and fellowship. And the second term, Rayhan, literally means basil. So, with the sweetness of a herb, that's what should characterize my and your and our relationships with people of all faiths. After Baha later, in writing to a Congress of World Faiths, talked about eternal peace among the adherents of religion. So now we get into a famous tablet, or a writing out of Abu Baha called the Seven Candles of Unity, which which was written in 1906, to a Scottish Baha'i. And this is the only color photograph of Abu Baha. It was taken in Paris. I don't know if it was 1911 or 1913. Because he was in France twice those years. Unity in the political realm. And he talks about these prophetically. First is unity in the political realm. And that is something that where sovereign states achieve unity among themselves. And it is a landmark development in human history, the formation of the United Nations, which is a sign of this unity coming to pass. The second candle of unity is unity of thought in world undertakings, scientific and otherwise. The third is unity in freedom. Next is unity in religion. Similar to the first principle, there's overlap. But Abu Baha says this is the cornerstone of the foundation of world peace. Unity of nations. This is distinct from political unity because, as you know, there's a distinction between a state and a nation. Usually we think of states as political entities and nations as a people, let's say, and you may have a mix of people in a nation state, and then if the nation states are created artificially with these artificial borders, peoples of herds may be in several states, and yet they comprise one people, one nation. Creates intercommunal conflict. Unity of races. The sixth candle. And then unity of language. These will all come to pass. You have just had a vision, a partial vision, a glimpse of the future in the not too distant future, according to the Baha'i perspective. Other types of unity, another photo, this is a studio photo of Abu Baha. He used to refuse to have his picture taken. We have a passport photo of him as a young man, no pictures of him for years. And then after he was liberated by the Young Turks Revolution, as a former prisoner of the Ottoman Empire, he allowed his photo to be taken when he traveled west. Okay, this is probably the unity that unites all the unities that we're looking at tonight. The consciousness of the oneness of humanity, which has a profound impact on everything. Imagine if this were the consciousness of politicians, how different foreign policies would be around the world. Unity of species. Abdul Baha often analogized to nature. We see him giving homilies on nature, as the early church fathers did, to illustrate spiritual principles. Unity of truth. Truth is not a multiplicity. Maybe our understanding and expression of it is, but there is but one truth. And we should all be searching for it concertedly, together, as well as individually. Unity of conscience, a very important principle. Abu Baha says there is not one soul whose conscience does not testify that in this day there is no more important matter in the world than that of universal peace. Until the minds of men become united, no important matter can be accomplished. At present, universal peace is a matter of great importance, but unity of conscience is essential. Therefore, Baha'u'llah, 50 years ago, expounded this question of universal peace at a time when he was confined in the fortress of Akka and was wronged and imprisoned. And I showed you that picture. So Baha'u'llah inaugurated what may be regarded as the first or one of the first international peace missions from his prison cell. For example, his second tablet to Napoleon had to be smuggled out of his prison cell in the brim of a hat of one of the few visitors that was allowed to visit Baha'u'llah. all unifying power, collective center. These are terms for the Baha'i covenant, which keeps the Baha'i faith from dividing into schisms. Unity of science and religion, a very, very important principle. The constraint here is that if science is not balanced by ethics, it can become a monster and a source of great evil, as we well know. And religion, unless counterbalanced by reason and by scientific proof, is going to become superstitious, and that's an evil in itself. Unity of the rights of men and women. This basically means equality of both sexes. Let me just go back here. We're making good time here. Let me just dwell on this point a little bit. In Vancouver, I was taking classes at the University of British Columbia. My wife helped me to go back to graduate school, to go to graduate school. And because I was a physical education major, I couldn't go directly into a religious studies program. We call it the academic study of religion because religious studies is ambiguous. While the subject matter is definitely religious, the approach is academic. So that's why we say it's preferable to say study religion. Religious studies means the same thing. And so I gave a Baha'i presentation locally on the UBC campus. And the host, had a big house. He was a doctor. And he said, Mr. Buck, what are you going to talk about tonight? And I said, the equality and superiority of women. And I won't say his name, but I mean, it's actually, I think he would be proud to hear this. But, I said, well, Dr. So-and-so, Baha says that under certain conditions, women may be superior to me and you. And I have the text to prove it. I issued it. I even wanted to give my presentation. There's an interesting story in London where Baha was mending his abba, his cloak. And this woman rights leader, a woman suffragette, came to Baha and said, I'm so impressed to see a prophet of God doing something as menial as mending his cloak. And Baha turned to her and said, I'm not a prophet of God. I'm simply a man like you. And then at one time he was giving his analogy of equality of men and women as the wings of a bird, and if one bird is crippled, the bird can't fly. And his audience wasn't accepting it. And Baha turned to his audience and said, what would you do if I proved to you that woman is the stronger wing? And then there's a book called Paris Talks, which are reported utterances about Baha, so they're not authoritative because we don't have the Persian text. The Persian text was stolen, unfortunately. But at the very end of this book is an authentic tablet, where Baha said in the future, the women will be neck and neck with the men and will equal them in all realms of human endeavor, political science, political politics, science, and so on. And there will come a day when the men will turn to women and will say, blessed are ye, for in everything you are our equal, and in regards to tenderness, mercy, and compassion, you are superior. So, we don't talk about we don't talk about the superiority of women, but it's there in the text. Unity in education. Well, one way to have unity in education is to have a universal curriculum with a universal ethics. Unity of husband and wife. Very important because the fundamental social unit of Baha'is believe is the family. Unity of the family. So, we're just cycling through this very quickly, and we can refer back to any of these texts during this discussion. 29 is Baha'i unity. And, it's important for the Baha'is to exemplify unity from the standpoint of moral and social authenticity. So you could say that the Baha'i community, which is a global community, is a social experiment. If the Baha'i teachings are all about unity, the proof of the pudding has to be unity within the Baha'i community. Hopefully this will be attractive, it will offer a model for others. Some people may choose to become Baha'is and join the community, but the important thing is to promote unity everywhere. That's our work, that's the work of Baha'is. Unity among Baha'i women, not a major Baha'i principle, but since it met my criteria of inclusion, I included this as one of my 50 principles. Unity of emotions. This does not appear in the English translation. So this is what you can find when you consult the Persian text. And my wife helped me, validate these readings in many of these Persian texts. So the translation says, all will become one. This is a talk that Abu Baha gave on June 9, 1912 at the Unitarian Church in Philadelphia. You're here. Does anybody know where this church is? Oh, we're in New Jersey. We drove through Philadelphia. Okay. So the transcription taken stenographically from the contemporaneous translation, this is what it says. All will become one, as one family, one people, and the same susceptibility to the divine bounty and education will be witnessed among mankind. Well, what does the original Persian say? It talks about 7 unities. One family, one nation, one people, one nation/homeland, one political system, oneness of emotions, oneness of education. Do you see how the Baha'i texts are consistently emphasizing unity in a broad range of social applications? In that one statement alone, we have 7 unities. Unity of the nations, or international unity. Unity of the spiritual assembly, the local Baha'i council. Unity of the Universal House of Justice and Governments. Now, the Baha'i texts are not terribly specific about the future world commonwealth, but it is anticipated that the Baha'i values will somehow become universal. Before lots of people become Baha'is, they'll just become generally accepted. And the Baha'i faith, it is predicted, will grow. And it's not something that will be forced on anybody, it will be something that people will be drawn to. And so at some point, if any country, the majority of which becomes Baha'i, then Baha'i principles will naturally be part of the principles of good governance. Baha'i teachings on minority rights are far higher than any other teachings I've seen so far. They've been accorded all rights. They won't be second-class citizens. But anyway, Baha'is are just a small minority, so this is all theoretical. But anyway, the relationship of Baha'i institutions to governments will be one of unity as well. Now, Shoghi Effendi, so it took the Baha'i faith 100 years to fully democratize itself into the system of elected, local, national, regional, and international councils. And I figured it was very important in this was Abu Baha's grandson. His grandfather, Abu Baha, died when he was attending Oxford University. And it came as a shock to him, but then he eventually assumed his position because Abu Baha, in his will and testament, appointed his grandson to lead the Baha'i world. So this is a picture of Shoghi Effendi here. And a watchword is, it's a common expression. I don't know how common it was in Shoghi Effendi's day, but they used it a lot, unity and diversity. So what does that mean? It means that unity means a lot of different things, but the one thing it doesn't mean is uniformity. Otherwise, you wouldn't have diversity, right? So that's another key concept. Respecting differences. Unity of the Baha'i revelation. So if we see that there are texts that appear to have a different perspective, we look for a resolution and so forth. Unity of doctrine. Now, as you know, the early church, by analogy, was plagued with doctrinal questions. And I remember taking a graduate course from at a Catholic college called Knox College on the University of British Columbia campus. And I took a graduate course on Arianism. And that was the first major theological controversy in the early church, the split of the church. And as one church father said, so one way you can see the difference, I'm just using this as a historical example, is the doxology, beginning of praise to God. There were two forms of it. Praise be to glory to the Father, through the Son, in the Holy Spirit. That's the traditional doxology. And the other doxology that was emerging in the 4th century was glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. That's what we call the equal and honor question. And so the bishop of the Church of Constantinople used to mumble the doxology. And his parishioners could not tell which version he was reciting. So he was approached by a couple of followers, and he asked him, Father, which version of the doxology are you praying? And he pointed to his hair, his white hair, and he said, my sons, when this snow melts, there will be plenty of mud. And it's considered the first joke in Christian history. So unity of doctrine, which can be very divisive, so it's important to have consensus of doctrine. Unity of administration, the way the Baha'is elect and administer their communities, follows definite procedures, and yet is flexible and adaptable. Evolving social unities, what are they? Well, the way that Baha'is look at the progression of humanity, so Baha'is believe not only in physical evolution, with a couple of teachings about spiritual evolution as well, but social evolution also. So it's easy to see in history that there has been unity of family, unity of tribe, unity of city-state, and unity of nations. And now world unity is the goal, is the will of God for this day and age, according to Baha'i beliefs. Unity of the world commonwealth. Another glimpse is the future, if the Baha'i teachings have insight, have foresight by virtue of insight. And I'm going to read this because we're making good time. This is from a book called The World Order of Baha towards the end, by Shoghi Effendi. The unity of the human race, as envisaged by Baha'u'llah, implies the establishment of a world's community in which all nations, races, creeds, and classes are closely and permanently united, and in which the autonomy of its state members and the personal freedom and initiative of the individuals that compose them are definitely and completely safeguarded. A world executive backed by an international force will carry out the decisions arrived at and apply the laws enacted by this world legislature, and will safeguard the organic unity of the whole Commonwealth. All right, here's some miscellaneous unities, and we'll round out our 50 unities and then get to the discussion. This is the seat of the Universal House of Justice on Mount Carmel. You may have heard that in 2008, the World Heritage Committee of the United Nations, which was meeting in Quebec at the time because the chair lived in Quebec, appointed the Baha'i shrines and gardens in Haifa and Akkad, Israel, as World Heritage Sites, and this is part of the Baha'i gardens in Haifa. And so, marking the Baha'i buildings and gardens and shrines as the first modern religious edifices to be protected by international law as World Heritage Sites that belong to the entire world. The mystic unity of God and His manifestations. Unity of meaning. Unity of doctrine. We have a similar one before. I'm going to have to check on that to see if there's overlap or not, but I think I had a distinction here. I have to look at my paper again to see what the distinction I made was. Unity of administration. Unity of vision. So we're united by a vision of, what it is that we're supposed to do to make the world a better place. Unity of action. It follows from our vision that we implement our principles, our Bahá'ís implement principles. Unity of purpose. They're similar, but if you think about these, if you meditate on them, they are all interconnected, which is, and so from a certain viewpoint, you could say that there's such profound overlap and depth that, in a sense, they all were talking about different manifestations of unity, but in their applications, from family relations to international relations, they are also useful to look at as separate principles. Unity of means. Unity with the environment. This is an interesting one because Al Gore, former vice president, who, as you know, is quite a prominent environmentalist, he quotes the Baha'i writings. So this is what Al Gore wrote. One of the newest of the great universalist religions, Baha'i, seems to dwell on the spiritual implications of the great transformation to which it bore fresh witness. And here is where he is quoting Shoghi Effendi. We cannot segregate the human heart from the environment outside us and say that once one of these is reformed, everything will be improved. Man is organic with the world. His inner life molds the environment and is itself deeply affected by it. The one acts upon the other. And every abiding change in the life of man is the result of these mutual reactions. Isn't that interesting? That the spiritual quality and the social quality of human society has a direct impact on the environment. And the last, I love this unity, the unity of the free, which comes from a letter from the Universal House of Justice. And this institution wrote, consider what Baha'u'llah has done. He revealed laws and principles to guide the free. He established an order to channel the actions of the free. He proclaimed a covenant to guarantee the unity of the free. Thus we hold to this ultimate perspective. Baha'u'llah came to set humanity free. His revelation is indeed an invitation to freedom. Freedom from want, freedom from war, freedom to unite, freedom to progress, freedom in peace and joy. Again, I'd like to invite your discussions. This is another question and discussion. This is a picture of Baha. You hear us? Any questions? Any ideas? Any thoughts? We're a small enough audience so you can hear each other. I want to give a special word of thanks to the Princeton University Club for sponsoring this event, to the USG Projects Board for co-sponsoring, and to the Office of Religious Life as well. And a special word of thanks to Emily Goshi, first-year graduate student in Princeton's Department of Religion. So thanks very much.
How are we doing on this? Pardon me? How are we doing on this since these were written? I mean, how much of this have we brought into being and how much remains?
Does we mean the world?
The world.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, every night we see conflict, people rising up, demonstrations in the Ukraine, civil war in Syria, African countries and so on in Congo. And so one of the things is that when Baha'i look at situations like this, which reflect profound disunity, they see a pattern happening. This is the pattern. There's the destruction of the old world order, the old way of things, colonialism, dictatorships, and so on and so forth. And the people are demanding good governance. That's one thing that people like these. I'm not an advocate of revolutions. Now, if you go to Bahá'íTeachings.org, I have the 9th part of a series called the Universal Emancipation Proclamation. And I'm talking about Elaine Locke. You'll see his graduation photo there. And a quote from an unpublished manuscript I found in the Elaine Locke papers at Harvard University. And Locke says that if you follow these principles, there will be no need of revolutions. So think of how much destruction and so on. Revolutions are not an efficient way to bring about permanent change. And that's how Elaine Locke talked about the importance of philosophy. He says that philosophy is a luxury among most people. But for a minority, philosophy is essential because it goes to social intelligence. And minorities need social intelligence. So we see the emergence of another principle, as the Bahá'u'lláh said in his open letters to kings and rulers, from amongst two ranks of men, power hath been seized, from kings and from ecclesiastics, and been given to the people. Note how people are bringing down their governments. It's not something I advocate, but it's surely a manifestation of this principle that power has been given to the people. So I would say that when you're looking at the bad news, try to see the pattern of the emerging good news beneath it. That's what would be my answer. Good question. Yes, sir.
So on the front of unity being distinct from uniformity, and I think that's obviously very clear with community and diversity. But to some of my friends who have discussed this idea, a lot of them were confused and they kind of had this idea that it's the same thing. Oh, we'll never be unified because we'll never agree on everything. And I think I actually believe that we'll never agree on everything, but that's not a bad thing. Apparently, I think it'd be worth discussing why the two seem to be synonymous in a lot of people's minds and what the distinction really is.
Okay, well, this is my understanding of the distinction. Is uniformity means that everybody has to be the same, whereas unity means that everybody must have similar or the same aspirations, values, and so on. See the difference? So people can be odd at times. We can have Big Brother, and there will be no unity inside. At least for those who are thinking individuals and are forced to act that way. But people who are united by common purpose and vision and values, in fact, it gives them the freedom to be more individual than in a society where they live in fear and uniformity is imposed upon them. That's the difference that I would see. Question?
Unity of religion. Most people today would probably say that religion is the source of Christianity.
Quite true. Not all religion, maybe most. And when I say, and I want to qualify that too. So for example, let's take Islam. When I first taught Islam, I was finishing my PhD at the University of Toronto, and my wife was working as an intelligence analyst in Ottawa, which is the Washington, D.C. of Canada. So I would commute, and so I taught at Carleton University, which is in Ottawa, and This never happened again, but in Ottawa, around half of my students were Muslim. And of course, they all wondered what version, quote unquote, of Islam I was going to teach. And before I get into how I approach contemporary Islam, to show you how divisive Islam can be among Muslims. Forget about the rest of the world. I tell you one story about what happened in my class. I had a mother and daughter from Pakistan who were my students. And the mother received a death threat from, I saw the letter, she showed me the letter, from a Bahá'í Muslim. What does that mean? An African Muslim. Because Bilal was the Ethiopian servant who became one of the first Muslims in Mecca. We know that you Pakistani Muslims are prejudiced against us. And to prove that you are true Muslims and you are not prejudiced, I demand that you marry both of your daughters, so now he knew that she had another daughter too, to a Bahá'í Muslim. I had to make arrangements with security to give her final exam to the mother and daughter in secret, and she withdrew from Carleton University and Alton University of Ottawa across the town. So, now, how do I approach Islam? I developed a typology of 7 Islamic responses to modernity. The first was radical Islamism. That's what we see in the news most today, right? Radical Islamism. Does it represent all Muslims? By no means. Then the next one was traditionalism. Then neo-traditionalism. Then modernism. Then secularism. Then postmodernism. Then post-Islamism. I might have left something out, but that might be 7. And so what I ask my students to do is, based on these patterns, to bring in clippings of current events. And we would discuss these in class. And I would ask the question of my students, which pattern, which response to modernity most reflects what's happening in this news story? And they started to get it after a while. Now, I had to be careful. It was my first time. One time I read the Surah of Joseph, Surah 12 of the Quran, aloud to my students. And I read it dramatically. Because it's the only surah, the only chapter of the Quran that's a complete narrative. And one of my students afterwards said, Dr. Buck, I wasn't a doctor, Professor Buck, this is not acceptable among Muslims, reading the Quran dramatically. You could receive a death threat for that. So I toned it down. But in answer to your question, I would say that in the news today, religion is the source of much of the violence. But the rest of religious adherents who are everyday working people, neighbors trying to do the best by their children and so on, why is it that a positive immigration policy can strengthen the country? Because, as I see it, the family values. Look, I blame my generation for the pandemic divorce rate that has made half of our children grow up with single parents. Many of them don't, and I'm not trying to be judgmental or anything, it's just that happened in my generation. So when I see immigrants come in with strong family values and of other religions, obviously Christianity wasn't enough to keep families together very well in the U.S. So religion can contribute to the solidarity and strengthening of society in its ideal form. You have a question, sir?
I picked up on what this gentleman said about community diversity. Now, in point number 15, it said something about the unity of the religions in pursuit of certain goal. And then point number 35 was, of course, unity and diversity. But I'd like to ask you, I'm going to give you a partner, and give you 2 alternatives, and I'd like to ask you which of these better represents the Baha'i vision for the future. Is it one in which the separate religions we have today still exist, but we have abandoned all elements which cause friction and disharmony between them, but continue to exist? Or is it a future in which all the religions will unify there's one religion and will be only one religion. Which of those two better describes Baha'i vision?
I would say both equally describe in stages. Using Baha'i terminology, the lesser peace and then the most great peace. So, when Baha'u'llah wrote to the kings and religious leaders of the world, and based on a 2010 article that I co-authored with a Russian Baha'i scholar at the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg, Baha'u'llah's proclamation was to scholars and statesmen as well as kings and ecclesiastics. Baha'u'llah said he offered the Baha'i principles of the most great peace. They were rejected. Baha'u'llah said, now that you have rejected the most great peace, hold ye fast to the principles of the lesser peace. So what is the lesser peace? It's pluralism, united by common values. What is the most great peace? Something that, an example of what Baha'u'llah did offer when he first wrote the Queens and Rulers, and that was in his tablet to Queen Victoria of England. He says, that which the Lord hath ordained as the sovereign instrument for, I'm just paraphrasing, the healing of the world of humanity is one common cause and one universal faith. I think that in the teachings of Baha, the predecessor of Baha'u'llah, is that every world religion had the potential to become a religion for the whole of the human race. But due to the immaturity of its followers, that did not happen. But in this day, according to Baha'i teachings, the fulfillment of all the prophecies, symbolic fulfillment of all the prophecies and aspirations of the world religions will come true. It will be a day that shall not be followed by night. Emily?
Yes, well, thank you again so much for coming. Certainly having me here. I'm curious to talk a little bit more about the difference between theory and action. So certainly, in the Baha'i faith, the theories about unity and the writings about unity are more extensive than they have been in previous religions. But as we know, each religion before the Baha'i faith also promoted unity in great ways.
Yes.
And as we've seen, some of these, and like you just said, sometimes the followers of the religion were not at a level of maturity to be able to carry out the teachings in perfection. Naturally, because Baha'is are not, we're in a place where we can carry out these teachings to perfection. Do you have any ideas about ways in which we can do our best to hold fast to these teachings of unity and not, because certainly we could have practices that don't reflect unity. How can we avoid that?
Okay, that's a good question, and it's something that I deal with every day. So I would say this is just practical advice for what it's worth. I'm not a counselor. Well, I am called a counselor sometimes, that's the truth. But I'm not a counselor, and I counsel my clients from time to time, so that you know. And I deal with all kinds of situations that are catastrophic and involve, profound disunity. Things I don't wish to deal with, but I have to professionally. Well, one of the things that one has to think about in terms of unity is that unity is daily. And so one of the Baha'i teachings is that every night we should bring ourselves to a reckoning. In other words, instead of waiting until the end of life, our own day of judgment, when it's all too punctual and also too late to make any changes, our day of judgment, our own reckoning, should be something that we initiate according to Baha'i teachings. And using the yardstick of unity, I can measure the unity or the disunity that my own actions generate, and then try to make the morrow better. And there's another Baha'i principle too, because how am I going to practice, in all practicality, all these 50 unities? Well, they overlap, right? I conceded that. I mean, the texts are distinct. Maybe the nuances are fine, but they help me get to 50. And so, one of the things that is a very interesting Baha'i principle we have here called attributes of God. And God is beyond attributes. Attributes are something that we can understand by regarding goodly deeds as godly acts. So we can connect goodness to godliness. And we have a calendar of 19 months and 19 days, where every day, every month, every year, and every cycle of years are named after attributes of God. Honor, dominion, sovereignty, knowledge, power, things like that. One of the teachings about the Baha is that if we manifest but one perfection, one attribute of God, the others will come into play. So using that same principle, my answer would be, if I focus on one unity at a time, for example, family unity. So my wife and my older son are here. And thank God we're a united family. And that was hard work. But my God, it is paradise. It is paradise on earth. And that's the point of my dissertation title, Paradise and Paradigm, where I argued that paradise texts in Christianity and in the Baha'i faith were more interested in the present-day social order than they were in the afterlife. They used afterlife concepts as a metaphor for the present life. So in all practicality, if we can concentrate on one unity at a time and measure by the yardstick of unity every night how well or poorly we did, and resolve to make tomorrow better, that's the practical advice that I try to follow myself. Thank you for that question. Okay, thank you, everyone.